You mentioned PyTorch in one of your answers a few minutes ago. Is that your go-to Python library for machine learning or deep learning specifically?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I really like PyTorch. I don't do as much machine learning as I do deep learning because my favorite AI implementation is probably neural networks. And
Mhm.
I'm once you find once you find a way of doing this, you kind of just repeat yourself. And I find that PyTorch has a very intuitive syntax. I know that
Mhm.
TensorFlow is also very popular, but I'm not as experienced with it. Um,
Yeah, it's become TensorFlow has become more PyTorch-like, and it has become more
mm,
intuitive. But for a while, TensorFlow was really a pain to use. You had to, yeah, there was a three-step process where you had to design your computational graph, and then as a second step, well, I'm actually forgetting what the three steps are now. I taught it for so many years. Set up your computational graph, initialize it. I can't remember what step two. And then step three was you actually start flowing data through it. And so it was this. It didn't work right away. Like you couldn't just flow data through functions. You had to set up your computational graph first. Oh yeah, yeah. So yeah, step one was setting the computational graph. Step two was allocating that graph to whatever computational resources you have. Um, so TensorFlow would split up depending on how many CPUs and or GPUs you had. It would split up
mhm.
the compute of that graph across all those different devices, and then finally in step three, you could flow information through it. And the PyTorch people came along and they were like, let's just make it run right away. Like, forget about that optimization. Let's just make it easier to use, like most Python programming is, especially if you're doing it in something like a Jupyter notebook.
Mhm.
Um, and so the TensorFlow people then, with their TensorFlow 2 release, caught up to that kind of idea of this immediate imperative programming. But for a while there, TensorFlow was a bigger pain. PyTorch is definitely, it is more Pythonic, and it also is much easier to follow up on stack trace issues. So when you get an error in TensorFlow, you get these super long stack traces that don't make any sense, even when you get all the way down to the bottom of the errors. And
Mhm.
so it ends up being like when I get a TensorFlow error, I copy and paste it into Google, and then I find the Stack Overflow, and then it says like, "Oh yeah, you need to add a comma or whatever," and I'm like, "Oh yeah, great." Whereas with PyTorch, you get the error, and typically I can just read it and understand what my mistake was and fix it.
Yeah, and generally there would be lots of support on it too, especially on Stack Overflow.
hmm Um, and then, in case listeners are wondering, so you might be wondering if you lose something by having it run that way, because I talked about how with TensorFlow, with that three-step process that it used to have with TensorFlow 1, that we had that second step where you were optimally allocating whatever compute you were doing in your graph to whatever devices you had. The trick now with the latest TensorFlow libraries as well as PyTorch all along is you run a script afterwards. So you have this, you can imperatively be executing code in your Jupyter notebooks like you're used to just running most other kinds of functions. And then once you have designed your model and you're like, well, now I'm actually going to train it on a huge number of devices, or I'm going to run this in production, then you can run a separate script that figures out how to allocate it optimally.
Yeah, absolutely. It's some sort of a switch these days. It's very, very easy. You either turn on and turn it off. Do you want to do this on GPU or CPU? Choose. Um, I definitely love this approach. What you just described about TensorFlow is truly intimidating, like TensorFlow 1. I'm glad
Yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
have a chance to play around with it.
Yeah, and there's no point in learning how to do that. It used to,
No.
for me, teaching it, it gave me so much more to talk about, and it meant that there was so much more value in like coming to me doing a TensorFlow course because there really was so much that you had to know. But yeah, this is the way things go. Things become easier, and that's great. Okay, so PyTorch is a library that you like. What other Python libraries do you love and use all the time?
I would say that my most favorite libraries are, it's not unique. It's NumPy and Pandas, which are very,
hmm
very useful. Like it's very
hmm
hard to avoid them. It doesn't matter what you do. So Pandas gives you a great way of creating complex data structures, and it gives you a great way of organizing tables and traversing tables. in terms of NumPy, what I really like about it is that it takes this, because Python is a very high level language. You're allowed to be as ambiguous as you want. You don't need to declare variables. You don't need to allocate a certain amount of space and memory, and you don't need to decide how many bits each piece of data takes. But with
Mhm.
NumPy, you can be so specific that you go down to almost this C++ level. Now, I find that these type of libraries that are basically based upon C languages rather than Python, they basically give the commands in Python, but the implementation is being made on a much lower level. And I think that those type of libraries is one of the reasons that Python becomes so popular.
Mhm.
So you can give your commands in a very ambiguous way. You don't have to be specific. You take care of the big picture, and you let Python worry about the small detail. Um, so with NumPy, it's a huge, huge advantage. That's what I find.